We have had 3 wonderful days in the schools. Each one of us, I think, has our own story to tell about what's happened here. And I think that what I would just like to say is that, that for me anyway, it has been a very warm and very wonderful experience, and I just want to acknowledge that. I want to also just say that when I had the chance to speak, I said to many of the young people there that this may be one of the most exciting and challenging times to be alive. And perhaps it's the most exciting and challenging time to be alive. Particularly when we think about what is in front of us in this 21st century and what we need to achieve and what we need to accomplish if really in the final analysis if the human species is going to survive into the future. And for those reasons, I think that it was important and is important to recognize that we are really in a moment of incredible transition, in my view. We are, as Thomas Berry, the philosopher and theologian, has said, we are caught between an old order and a new order. We're caught between a time when the Technozoic age is coming to an end of the industrial model, the industrial civilization that we have built up and everything. That is slowly but surely coming to an end, and we are ushering in an ecozoic era, or an era that many call the ecological age. The question is whether or not we're going to be able to make that transition. And the time framework for that transition is going to be the 21st century. And so to young people, the question was, can you see yourselves getting prepared for that? Can you see yourselves taking up that challenge? Can you see yourselves paving the way for the transition that needs to take place? And regardless of whether what walk of life you end up going into, whatever profession you end up taking on, whatever form of work you end up doing, somehow or another, these questions and these issues will be front and center for you in your community, in your families, and in your daily lives. So the question is, can we prepare ourselves for that? And that's essentially what we were doing and what we were discussing. This is an historical moment, and it's a moment of historical change. And like it or not, it's going to happen. And the question is, can we make it happen the right way? So I want to share some of those thoughts with you today. Also some other thoughts that we didn't get a chance to talk about with the youth. But I just want to share with you some of the challenges that we were addressing and move on from there. So there's 3 parts to this presentation. The first is to look at 2 very prominent eco-crises challenges facing us in the 21st century. What I mean by eco-crisis, I'm talking about ecological crises facing us in the 21st century. We'll hear about others in terms of the other presentations later. Secondly, I want to step back from that and focus in on a particular case study and a particular example of how that's happening in my own country with the development of what's known as the tar sands, and comment on how pathological that really is. And the third thing I want to do is talk about what it means to bring about some change around this. What kind of great turning is going to have to take place in our lives, in our institutions, and the way in which we govern ourselves, and that great turning that needs to take place if, in fact, we are going to make the transition possible. So those are the 3 parts of this presentation as such. So the first part, let's look at these 2 really critical issues that are in front of us right now. First of all, I want to take a look at the climate crises, and then followed by the water crises. I think we all know what we're talking about in terms of the climate crises, the whole challenge of global warming, the fact that the International Panel on Climate Change made it very clear that a 2-degree increase this century in the warmth of the planet would create a heating of the planet which would cause enormous potential of climate catastrophe. 2 degrees. And then later on, 100 other countries said 2 degrees is too much. They said 1.5 degrees is a better reading of where we have to go in this century, and we have to hold the heating of the planet to 1.5 degrees. The Kyoto Accord that came into being in 1997 was meant to be a legally binding, enforceable agreement to get all countries engaged in the process of reducing systematically over a period of time, reducing their greenhouse gas emissions progressively over the next 25 or 50 years, so that we would be in a position to meet that 2-degree target at the very least. Most industrialized countries, unfortunately, however, have not made the changes that are necessary. And we have to keep in mind here that 80%, historically, 80% of the carbon emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions that have occurred as a result of the industrialized countries. And so the burden, therefore, is very much on the industrialized countries to deliver. 12 years after Kyoto, we had the Copenhagen summit that took place in 2009, the Conference of the Parties number 15 that took place, and at that point, a major shift took place. The United States entered into the picture and convinced a number of other countries to join them in moving away from Kyoto. And we now find the situation slipping away in terms of that Kyoto Accord. What's happened is that the Kyoto Accord is gradually being replaced by something else altogether, something called a pledge and review regime that's not binding, but voluntary, not enforceable. And what happened in Copenhagen in 2009 and in Cancun in 2010 has been the extension of this new process of pledge and review, therefore replacing the Kyoto Accord. The pledges that have been made so far by these countries, particularly by the industrialized countries, will mean if they continue on that track, we will be facing an increase in the temperature of the planet by 4 to 5 degrees by the end of the century. And this is the United Nations Environment Program making this analysis based on the latest projections and pledges that have been made. So we're at a situation now where a possible 4 to 5 degree world comes into being in the 21st century, and at the same time, many scientists within the IPCC are also saying that 1 degree increase is perhaps even too much. So we are really facing an enormous challenge here of incredible proportions. 9 days from now, Durban will be the next conference, big environment summit conference, and we may very well see the collapse of the Kyoto Accord. It'll remain there in name. It'll always sort of be there in name, partly because the corporations have found a way of making money off of it. But the actual intent, the actual purpose of the whole regime has been disintegrating and falling apart. And we are now at a point where we are facing some very serious tipping points. The melting of the Arctic is giving rise to the release of methane gas into the atmosphere. And methane is more lethal than carbon emissions are. We're seeing the dieback, release of the dieback gases into the atmosphere as we've seen it in Australia. And we're seeing the melting further glaciers and ice and ice sheets, which are going to have a major impact. We have to keep in mind that there is an enormous climate debt that's owed from the north to the south, in the sense that the industrialized countries, having been responsible for 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions historically, have a debt that they owe to the rest of the planet in the global south. And yet it is the developing countries in the global south that will experience the greatest burden of climate change itself. And then on top of that, we will likely see enormous movement of peoples as climate refugees respond to the famine and the drought that is going to arise, the flooding that is going to take place, and the forest fires that are going to proliferate. So that's the climate crisis that we're facing. Now, it's not just a climate crisis we face in the 21st century, ecologically speaking, that is. There are many others. But the one I want to focus in on for a moment is the water crisis, because we are walking into a really dark period as far as the water issues are concerned, as well as the climate issues. We are seeing a major depletion of fresh water around the world as worldwide demand for water doubles every 20 years. Now that's twice the rate of population growth. By the year 2025, the demand for fresh water will outstrip the supply of fresh water by something in the neighborhood of 56%, say many scientists today. And one of the main reasons for this water depletion that is taking place is the damage that is being done to the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. Now, the water cycle, of course, is that process we're all familiar with in nature, where precipitation in the form of rain or snow or whatever falls from the atmosphere to the ground, goes into the ground, and evaporates back again. That process has been systematically damaged over a period of time and is now reaching a point where we are losing volumes, huge volumes of water in the hydrologic cycle, according to a number of scientists that have been studying this. What has happened is that as we build our cities and pave over the land, that's one way in which the hydrologic cycle has been damaged progressively over a period of time. But even more so, industrial agriculture has done a great deal of damage to the soils and to the earth, and when water falls on the earth itself, it gets mixed up with the toxic chemicals and then ends up being part of poisoned water, and that's no good to any of us. And then thirdly, the industrialization that takes place through the industries that are built and the chemicals, again, that have been spewing into the groundwater systems. All of this is contributing to a shortening and a shrinking, I should say, a shrinking of the availability of fresh water supplies. The result of this is that, according to a team of scientists in Croatia led by a scientist by the name of Michael Kravsik, and he's been studying this over the last 2 or 3 decades and these trends, is that we are in a situation where by the year 2025, 1/4 of the water that would normally be in the hydrologic cycle will have been lost. And their calculations based on the fact that 1,800 billion cubic meters of water every year disappears from the hydrologic cycle because of these trends that I've just been mentioning. And so that by the year 2025, 45 billion cubic meters will not be there in terms of freshwater supplies. So we are faced with a huge challenge on that front, to the point where if we keep moving along these trend lines for the remainder of this century, we may very well find ourselves facing enormous water shortages by the end of the century, freshwater shortages. And so I think we need to take stock of all this and to try to understand what this really means. So there you have it, two really fundamental issues that are facing us in the 21st century. What we do about it, how we change the way we operate and the way we live and everything is going to be really incredibly important. At the heart of this, however, and I'll come back to this a little later, but at the heart of this is the economic system that we have created. And we have to understand that we are not going to bring about a lot of changes here and change course significantly without dealing with the model of growth that our economy is based on, without dealing with our models of production and our models of consumption. These have to be areas of fundamental change in the 21st century if we are going to make the transition we're talking about to the ecological age. So that's the first part. Now the second part I want to, thanks to Alan, I want to share with you a story in Canada that we have in Canada regarding something called the tar sands. And I don't know if anybody has heard about the tar sands here or not. If you have, could you put your hand up? Okay, quite a few, all right. Well, in talking about the tar sands, I'll just briefly say this, that we are dealing with an unconventional source of oil. The conventional source of oil, of course, is that oil is in the ground just below the surface and you drill down and you get the oil and you pump it up. Unconventional sources are when you find bodies of oil or oil-like substances beneath mountains and rock basins, or you find them deep beneath the ocean floor in the sea, and therefore very difficult to get at, therefore environmentally damaging to extract. And so the tar sands is in that category, and actually is probably the largest potential pool of oil to be found anywhere on the planet. We're talking about something called bitumen. Bitumen is a tar-like substance, like we put on paving our roads and so forth. We pave it often with tar. And the tar-like substance is called bitumen. And this bitumen is located deep below a sedimentary rock basin in northern Alberta called the Athabasca region. And in that region, there are something like 2 to 2.5 trillion barrels of oil potentially there. Now, only at 285 billion barrels is recoverable at the present time, given current technologies. But you get an idea that there's a huge amount of potential there that could be developed over a period of time with improving in new kinds of technologies. But as I will show you, it also has enormous environmental consequences. Will I just press that there? Okay, there we go. Just want to show that what we're going to be talking about here, and these slides I hope will give you a visual picture of what we're talking about is happening in the tar sands. And this is, as I say, up in northern Alberta. The population base up there is really Aboriginal peoples. They have been there for many, many centuries, going back historically really to roughly 32,000 years. And but this is their land, and their land is now being developed for this massive oil deposit that exists. The Athabasca tar sands, in the pink there, you see the area that will be developed. This is the whole of the province of Alberta. A big chunk of that will be developed for the tar sands. It's at least the size of of the United Kingdom, and or the size, whichever measurement you want to take, but certainly the size of the United Kingdom. Some say the size of Florida, some say the size of other provinces in Canada. Anyway, gives you an idea of how big it is and how far-reaching it can be. There are two forms of extraction that are used. One is the strip mining. Roughly 5% of the tar, 5 to 7% of the tar sands is being developed through strip mining. These, where they bring in these huge earth removers and they strip mine the boreal forests, and then they start to get at the bitumen that lies below the shallow areas of the sedimentary rock basin. The other method is the in situ method, which will be used throughout most of the tar sands area. That is taking hot water, taking water, heating it up, and pumping it down into the sedimentary rock basin to the bitumen, liquefying the bitumen, and then pumping it up. So it's quite a process that. And that will be used for about 93 to 95% of the production in the tar sands, and is being used already in that way. This development is highly resource intensive. A huge amount of natural gas is used and is burned. And the burning of that natural gas, of course, creates greenhouse gas emissions. And it's the same old story of taking a relatively clean fuel, burning it in order to get at another fuel and digging it out, another fossil fuel, and digging it out of the ground, or digging it out of, in this case, the rock basin. And secondly, it uses a great deal of water, anywhere between 2 and 5 barrels of water for every barrel of oil that's produced coming out of the tar sands. This gives you a brief idea of if you could look a little closer, you'd see the production plans. These are the production plans of the companies going up to the year 2015. There are other charts that show to 2020, to 2025, and to 2030 in terms of the production plans. This gives you an idea of the pipeline system that exists from the northern parts of Alberta, but particularly the northern parts of Alberta, coming down through various pipeline systems, all, as you can see, for the most part, designed to deliver oil to the United States. And of course, keeping in mind the United States wants to wean itself or get itself off of dependence upon Middle East oil, which are unpredictable, and wants to get its oil in the future from Canada, but it means that it's going to be at a huge ecological price as a result of it, which we'll see in just a minute. These are some of the companies and corporations that are involved in the process itself and are a big part of what is happening. Now I'm going to skip over a few things right here, excuse me, to the environmental impacts. We will see in a few moments what this land looks like when the trees are there, when the forests are there. This is what it starts to look like when the forests have been stripped away and the other earth removers are at work to get it ready for getting the oil out of the ground. As a result of burning so much of that natural gas in order to go through the process of extraction and of upgrading of the oil itself, we have a situation where the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are generated from the tar sands are anywhere between 3 and 5 times that of conventional oil production. And as a result, the tar sands is not only Canada's #1 global warming machine, but it is also probably the fastest growing global warming machine to be found on the planet. As you may be able to see from where you are, that this gives you an idea of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of millions of tons that are produced every year as a result of what's happening. Now you can see it goes up and up and up from roughly, here we are in 2011 at 113 million tons, and it goes up to 2020, and there will be 184 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions generated. And the reason for that is the expansion, the production is expanding. It's expanding every year. And as the production expands, so do the greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon emissions. And there's no way of really regulating that without stopping the actual level of production and the increases in production. Here's that photo that I was going to mention before. I had mentioned before, namely the boreal forests up there. This is what the land looks like with the trees in that area. This is the boreal forests that stretch across the northern part of the planet and are the northern lungs of the planet. And then when you, as a result of the extraction and the earth removal and everything that takes place, where the arrow points is what it looks like after it's been strip mined, after the process is underway to get at the oil itself. So you can see it moves from a beautiful nature scene to a scene that's very much like the moon itself, or it's a moonscape kind of imagery that results from there. And anybody who's been up there, and I've been up there a number of times, it's just amazing how that keeps growing and expanding year after year after year, the amount that's turned into that moonscape and what it looks like. One of the big impacts of this is going to be water depletion. And one of the reasons, as I said, when you use 2 to 5 barrels of water to produce every barrel of oil, a huge amount of fresh water is required. This is one of the most precious freshwater systems in the entire world. There are 3 rivers here, the Athabasca River, the Peace River, and the Mackenzie River, and they all interconnect. And it's considered to be one of the 3 most precious freshwater systems in the world. What's happening is that the water levels are dropping every year, dropping significantly in all 3 of these rivers and having a huge impact. And not only this, but there is serious water contamination resulting. You can imagine with all of the chemicals, the toxic chemicals that are used in the extraction and the refining or upgrading process, that when those chemicals are used, they end up having to be stored somewhere. And where they end up being stored along with the water is in these man-made lakes that exist right up here. If I could, that's one of the lakes right there. It's one of many lakes that are created around each of the production sites. And the problem, of course, is that when that happens, those lakes contain water, and when there are leaks in the lakes, the toxic chemicals seep into the groundwater system. And when it goes into the groundwater system, it starts to affect the food chain downstream. And the people that are most directly affected, again, are the First Nations, the indigenous peoples, because they depend upon the wildlife for their food. They depend upon the fish, they depend upon the moose, and so forth. Over to the right here, you have a picture of a deformed fish. And that is exactly what's happened, is that the fish life has been completely deformed in this area. And as a result, many people are suffering now from a rare form of cancer in this region. That gives you an idea of the tar sands itself and the expansion that's taking place, and that only a portion of that original picture that I showed you that was pink in color has been developed. But by the year 2030, all of that area will be completely developed if the current production system continues. And what has happened in this process is that we have to step back from it and sort of ask ourselves, what does this mean? What does this really mean? And I think what it really means is that we have a very pathological setup here, a very pathological result. There's something sick, very sick, both about the results of this kind of development and secondly about the mindset that leads to this kind of development. And I think it goes back again and forces us, or compels us, I should say, to think about what it means when we have a planet and parasites are set loose in the planet. What's happening with the tar sands, in my view, is an example of the parasites being set loose upon the planet and what that really means in terms of the future health of the Earth itself and what we are doing to it. I think we have to also, when we think about this, it's the pursuit of money, it's the pursuit of wealth. And what is that really, what kind of illusionary understandings do we have about wealth? And what does this really mean about, as some people call it, money colonizing life itself? What is happening is that destruction of a considerable nature of life itself in all forms is taking place as a result of that development that is going on in the tar sands. It's a kind of a cancerous growth that is taking place, not just because it's producing cancer in the indigenous people's lives downstream, but also it's just cancerous in the sense it's growing, and it's growing every day. And the level of production is going up and up and up and up, not stabilizing, but going up and up and up. And so I think what we're faced with in many ways is a poisoning of life itself. Thank you. And a depletion of the earth itself. And as we see this growing and developing, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of view of life are we projecting here? What kind of model of the economy are we projecting here? What kind of paradigm for the future of the planet are we projecting here? And it seems to me this is something that really needs to be directly challenged and dealt with. Okay, let me move to the third and final part, and that is that somehow we've got to make a turn out of this and we've got to change our ways of doing things. And I go to the term called the Great Turning and draw upon Johanna Macy, who is a well-known person in the United States that has given a great deal of leadership on the issue of what needs to happen and the challenges that we face in the 21st century. And both Johanna Macy and David Korten together have given thought to the whole idea that we are faced with two really paths in the future. One is what they call the Great Unraveling, and that is that we've come to this point in the Technozoic era that we've been talking about, and everything starts to unravel because we've lost control of everything, and it's just moving out of control, and the destruction is moving out of control. Or that we start to turn the corner and start to go through a great turning, and in terms of our way of doing things, our model of production, the model of the economy itself, and realize that we need to make some fundamental changes in the way we govern our lives. And it seems to me that what they have both done in helping us to see the direction that is taking place here is to see that we could go down the path of the great unraveling, or we could go down the path of the great turning. And they put it this way, that we have to ask what our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren are going to say from now on. I don't know about some of you, but I have grandchildren. And I think with those grandchildren, when I play with them, I think about some of these things because of the enormous impact that this could have on their lives and the decisions that they will have to make. And I think we will all need to be thinking about that as we look at the kind of challenge that we're facing today in this defining moment of the 21st century. So whether we go down the path of the great unraveling, which is what we see with the tar sands, or whether we go down the path of the great turning, is a decision that only we can make. And we need to make that decision in the light of the kinds of things we've been talking about. If we're going to go down the path of the great turning, then there are three kinds of turnings that need to take place. And I just want to briefly walk through these three turnings. The first turning is the cultural turning. And this is a turnaround that needs to take place in terms of our social values and how we look at life and how we value life and how we value the world in which we're living in and the earth itself. This is a cultural turning that also moves towards a deepening spiritual awareness. Now, I'm not talking about religion here. I'm talking about a deepening spiritual awareness that comes from an understanding that the earth is part of the cosmos is part of the universe. We are part of something bigger, much bigger than just what exists on this planet. And seeing things in that larger vision, seeing that larger cosmological vision, is part of the cultural turning that needs to take place as far as the human species is concerned, in my view. Secondly, we need to go through an economic turning. As I've already indicated, an economic turning that says, how can we perpetuate an economic system that is based upon increasing economic growth? How can we cling to an economic system that judges the progress of that economic system in terms of the gross national product and increasing economic growth? How can we do that? How can we continue models of production, such as we've seen here, but not just here, in many other ways, models of production that have do such enormous damage to both the climate itself and to water and to other aspects of the environment itself? How can we continue with those kinds of models of production? And how can we continue with models of consumption which demand ever improving and changing forms of luxury products and everything else that we think we need for a comfortable life on this planet? So I think that we need to definitely rethink our models of production and our models of consumption, and both of these have to be rethought in the light of our economic system, which is dependent upon economic growth. And thirdly, we need to go through a political turning, a turning that recognizes that there has to be changes in our models of governance and in our models of participation and the whole question of people participating in decisions affecting their lives. Our concepts of democracy have to be overhauled, and we have to re-examine what it means to work at a local level, with a regional and national level, with an international level in mind, and how to reconstruct our global institutions to respond to the concerns and interests and priorities of people emerging out of their local and regional communities. All of these things are part of the process and the turning that needs to take place if, in fact, we are going to make that transition that we've been talking about. To do this means that we need to become agents of social change. As I was saying to the students, do you want to become an agent of social change? Do you want to become a real agent of transition during this period of the 21st century? And what does it mean to do that? Well, it means going through these three kinds of turnings. It also means that if we're going to do that, and we're going to enter into an ecological age, we've got to start to cultivate an ecological psyche. We've got to start to look at the world through a different set of lenses. And it's interesting that it was Albert Einstein who reminded us that as humans, we live in a kind of prison, what he called the prison of an optical delusion, an optical delusion. And it was that we can only see clearly our own interests and priorities and our own self-interest and the self-interest of maybe the ones that are around us, our loved ones, and maybe some close working friends and neighbors. That's about it. That's an optical illusion that we have as human beings. And he said that we've got to come out of that optical illusion into a kind of ecological psyche where we start to develop and expand circles of compassion that go beyond that. Circles of compassion that end up embracing life itself on the planet and start to embrace the whole of nature itself. And he said that is only going to happen by expanding our circles of compassion. And so I think what he was pointing to definitely was a notion of expanding our circles of compassion to embrace an attitude of, yes, love, but beauty and wonder at the incredible planet we have within the context of the universe itself. And I think that was what he was aiming at in terms of what he was saying at that time. So it's the question of us all developing those exercises of expanding our circles of compassion. And I think if we're talking about the cultural turning, that is what we're talking about. That is what the cultural turning really means. The other part that I have been working on and has been the economic turning, and I only will briefly touch on this to say that we are, when we really think of the kind of world we're living in today, when we're thinking of the kind of economic growth model of our economic system, and we talk about changing those models of production and changing those models of consumption, we've got to come up with very practical ways of doing this. And I think a lot has already happened from what I gather from the students and their teachers. A lot is already happening here in this part of Austria, when people are recognizing that we need to make a shift away from our dependence upon fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And so you have solar energy projects developing here, you have geothermal projects developing here, and you have biomass developing here as well in this region. And that's really important. But in my country, that's slow in developing. And so what we are doing is we're putting together a whole new alliance of civil society organizations to move in this direction, to start to develop the transition, that transition we've been talking about from our dependence upon fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And we're working because we have enormous potential for geothermal, for biomass, and particularly for solar and for wind energy. And we're making that transition and working at that now and developing some very interesting projects with all of these groups involving labor unions and cooperatives and social justice organizations and faith communities, et cetera, working together to start to build this process. But at the same time, we're also working on two other things, and one has to do with, again, something you're doing here, and that's building retrofits and energy conservation. Taking all of our buildings, our residential buildings, our commercial buildings, and our industrial buildings, and going through a major overhaul of these buildings in terms of making sure that they have access, that they provide proper energy conservation. And so this is another step in this direction, and I know that's happening here in this region as well. And finally, in the area that you've already developed well in this country and all throughout the whole of Europe, and that's public transit. Where I come from in our country, partly because of the incredible expansive nature of the country and the large landmass, we do not have the kind of public transit that you have, and we certainly do not have the high-speed rail that exists in between urban corridors and urban centers. And so we are now organizing and moving in that direction, recognizing that we have to make a fundamental change in terms of our transportation of both people and freight if we are going to have an impact upon carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions as a result of that. So those are steps that we're taking in that direction, and there's a whole strategy and a whole program of activity that we are developing in our own country around that. But I only bring that to your attention to show that there are steps and concrete steps that can be taken to actually move forward in terms of this economic turning that I was talking about. So the cultural turning and the economic turning, those are two really important areas. The political turning, we have not figured out yet. We've got a real problem with our governance in our country, and it's going to continue to be a problem for some time. But we figured if we get the cultural turning going and if we can get the economic turning going, then we'll eventually turn our attention to the political turning and make a big U-turn there when the time comes. Let me just say in conclusion, the other night we were all together, or many of us were together for the opening of the Project of Hope for this year. And it was a wonderful evening. And in the course of the discussions that took place with, that the three of us had anyway with the journalists, we had a great opportunity to talk in the end about the revolution of the heart. And I think we all found ourselves wrestling with what that really meant. And in the end, we sort of talked about the revolution of the heart also goes along with the revolution of the head and the revolution of the hand. And I feel very strongly, as we were talking about that night too, that there are ways in which we can help motivate and stimulate the revolution of the heart. And I have learned for some time, thanks to Leonardo Boff, that the way to do that, for me at least, is to learn to listen to the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth. It's by listening to the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth that we will revolutionize the heart to help us revolutionize our head and our hands. Thank you very much.